So Unit 1 is titled Political Systems, Regimes, and Governments. And so the way that I taught the course was that we introduced all these concepts and then we looked at these specifically based on countries. So we've done and talked about all of this, and actually a lot of Unit 1 is really kind of the concepts part, if you will. So the first part we'll talk about is kind of thinking like a political scientist, quantitative versus qualitative data, empirical versus normative statements, and then correlation versus causation. Then we've got political systems, types of regimes, democratization, and then we will not get through all of this today. Remember, we have plans to talk tomorrow too, and we'll talk more about what democratization looks like, power and authority, how that is divided in a country, federal and unitary systems, why a country chooses one over the other, and then legitimacy, which I realize I spelled wrong. All right, so let's think about this for a minute. Quantitative versus qualitative, empirical versus normative, correlation versus causation. So we're doing a quantitative question. So remember that quantitative, always think about quantity, right? So numbers. So we're looking at that, and so you're reading, that's your scientific aspect. That's your making an empirical statement based on kind of your quantitative data, okay? And then when we're thinking about sources of data, especially for our quantitative and empirical, then we can think about HDI, which remember is Human Development Index. So that helps us when we think about developing countries, you know, what's the status for people. We can look at all those things, you know, we can find on CA, World Factbook, literacy rates. We can, you know, when you look at Nigeria, like for an example, when we're looking at data, when we look at northern Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim, it is Sharia law, they also have lower literacy rates. They also have lower vaccination rates. They have a lot of things. There's a difference there. And then there's a huge gap between men and women compared with southern Nigeria. So I can report that data, and then what conclusions can I draw from that? That's when I start getting into making those normative statements. I'm making a value judgment based on that. So maybe I could say something to the extent of, due to Sharia law and the role of women in a traditionally Muslim home, women are not as likely to receive education, okay, which might explain, you know, the lower literacy rate. And so we can look and see how that maybe affects that. Freedom House is another great source of information. So how free is a country? So you compare, say, China, which is not very free. Russia wouldn't be considered very free, to say like Mexico. Gini coefficient, that has to do with the kind of how equal everyone is. And so like that would be something you'd see in Norway, Sweden, like really kind of socialized countries, versus like the United States is never going to have what will be considered like a good Gini coefficient, because we have a gap in income. So this is basically measuring what's your gaps in income. GDP, GNP, which measure your gross domestic product, gross national product, also purchasing power parity. I wouldn't focus too much on these because those terms are economic terms and we won't see as much on the test, but you could maybe have a question that has a chart that you might need to infer from that economic information. The Fragile States Index. So we talked about how that could Nigeria be a failed state? Like, are they providing for the needs of their country? And so Fragile States Index helps look at that. The governmental transparency. You know, we talk about a lot after we study U.S. government that we kind of get a little frustrated with the U.S. government, but we're fairly transparent, especially compared to, say, you know, China or Iran or Russia. And then the corruption perception, which, remember when we watched that video on Eric Lee, you know, China, they don't think that there's a lot of corruption, but they're admitting that it's more. But like Nigeria, corruption is a huge problem. And so this is kind of the perception of corruption in your country. So those terms are very important to keep straight, qualitative versus quantitative as we're looking at data, okay? And then from that, you might be asked to make an empirical or normative statement, all right? So now let's think a minute about correlation and causation. So a correlation, there is a relationship between two things. But just because there is a correlation, that does not mean causation. So remember, correlation does not mean causation. Causation, if it's a causation, there's typically also a correlation. Like there has to be some kind of relationship to cause one thing to lead to another. So let's say that we're talking about countries that are rentier states. So the idea of the resource curse, which is countries that are rich in, say, oil, one of the things that we notice about countries that are rich in oil is they tend to have lower political participation, okay? So is there a correlation between political participation and the amount of oil that a country has, okay? There is definitely a type of relationship. Does one cause the other? That's the real question. And so you have to do a little bit more research to determine if there is a causation. And so when we're looking at, say, the OPEC states, there is definitely, it seems to be a causation that because of the richness of oil in these countries that have what we call the resource curse, for example, like Nigeria, Iran, then there's not as much need to participate in politics and such. All right, so let's move on. Your favorite little chart. This is the point where I teach this, that everyone hates me this day. But this is a really great way for us to think about how countries are organized. So a state is a country, okay, the way we use the word country. So for a state, to be a state, you have to have sovereignty and authority over the area that you're in. You have to have this recognized government. So remember, nations can be a state, but not all nations are states, okay? So Germany is a nation. Germany is also a state, okay? Wales, Scotland, they are both nations. They are not states, okay? So remember that a state, you have that authority. A regime is your type of political authority, your power, your, if you will, your government, okay? What actually runs your country? Are you a democracy or are you authoritarian? And then your government is the leaders in power of your country. All right, so let's look at this as a specific example. So we'll work through our countries. For the United Kingdom is the state. The regime, they're a constitutional monarchy, they're a democracy, okay? Their government is currently led by Boris Johnson of the Conservative Party. The United States is our state. Our regime is a democracy that we've had since the late 1700s. Our government is currently led by President Trump, okay? The Russian Federation is a state. Their regime, probably they're semi-authoritarian, we would argue at this point. Their government is led by their new prime minister, who I can't remember his name, and President Putin. All right, so that's, keep those straight. Now remember, we can have regime changes and we can have government changes, but we're going to come back to those types of changes in a little bit. So this is from Mr. Canine. He made this. This is one of those documents that I shared with you. But this is just, I thought, a really nice little chart that kind of puts every country, and I like that we were comparing the U.S. too, because we've studied the U.S. When was the regime established? Okay. So we could argue the United Kingdom Magna Carta tradition. I'd really argue actually with the Glorious Revolution and the petition, the Bill of Rights that William and Mary were forced to sign, okay? They are a democratic regime, constitutional monarchy, an example of government change when Prime Minister David Cameron, stepped down and Theresa May was chosen by her party to be the new Prime Minister. United States, our regime established, of course, with the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution. We are a democracy. When President Trump became the new president would be an example of governmental change. Mexico, that 1917 revolution, getting rid of Porfirio Diaz, and they started a democracy, though, of course, it was a one-party state and wasn't super democratic to begin with. It was a slow process. But moving from the past president Nieto to the current president AMLO would be another example. So through election. In China, when Mao led the communist revolution, they set up an authoritarian regime. We have seen party change, you know, in the leadership. The current president Xi, who who President Hu Jintao was before him. Xi Jinping was his current leader. Russia, the constitution that was established after the fall of the Soviet Union, and a governmental change would be like from President Putin to President Medvedev back to President Putin. Iran, with the 1979 revolution, that one date, the only date I'd encourage you to remember for Iran, when they set up the theocratic republic, the authoritarian state, when President Ahmadinejad switched to President Rouhani, who is the current president. Nigeria, they have had several constitutions. They had lots of military coups we talked about, but they've had a continuing democracy for a while now, the same regime. And when we move from Goodluck Jonathan to Muhammad Buhari, who is the current president, would be another example. And then I just took this actually as a snapshot from one of our notes that we did at the beginning of the year, just reminding you kind of those differences between each of these. So just remember that a state has to have sovereignty and authority, okay? Scotland doesn't have full sovereignty and authority. That's why it can't be a state. Palestine doesn't have full sovereignty and authority. Taiwan, Tibet, they don't have full sovereignty and authority. Government, the people who are actually, it's like this is the people in charge. The regime, that is your type of organization. Are you democratic or are you authoritarian? So just to remind us about nations. So the UK, the United Kingdom of Northern Ireland, of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, is made up of 4 nations: the Welsh, the English, the Scottish, and the Northern Irish. So a nation, remember, is a people with a common culture and a common language. Doesn't have to be maybe as clear-cut as this. You can also think about in China, for example, the Uyghurs, they're a nation. The Tibetans are a nation. The Chechens are a nation in Russia. The Kurds are a nation in Iran. And so we're talking about people with a common culture and a language. And then most states, most countries have lots of little different nations in their country. Most countries are not super homogeneous. Even China, which is 92% Han Chinese, still has nations within China, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs. Okay, so all of those would fall as a nation. So of course would the Han Chinese. So our types of regimes, we have democracies and we have authoritarian regimes. The most extreme authoritarian regime, if I can think about 2 for a minute, would be a totalitarian regime. So we think about like Stalin or Hitler, but authoritarian is that small group or an individual who exercises the power of the state. And a democracy, on the other hand, has power that is directly or indirectly by the people. So that consent of the governed gives them the authority to rule. Within democracies, we have types of democracies. Remember that we have liberal and illiberal democracies. Liberal democracies and illiberal democracies both share that they have free, fair, competitive elections. What makes them differ is the fact that in an illiberal democracy, they fail to protect basic civil liberties and civil rights. So there might be freedom of speech, freedom of press. There might be LGBT rights that are missing. Okay, so when we think about our countries that we're studying, the United States and the UK would be the most advanced democracies, liberal democracies. Mexico would be considered mostly a liberal democracy. Nigeria is still an illiberal democracy. They don't have full civil liberties, civil rights protected. There's a lot of corruption. Russia is semi-authoritarian if you're not ready to call it full authoritarian. Iran would be considered authoritarian, as would China. Okay, so we have almost a 3-3 split when we're looking at our countries. Russia is super close if it's not full. So questions to consider when we're thinking about our regimes and thinking about the different types is of the elections. Are they free, fair, competitive? So that's really our issue with Russia, is the fact that at this point, how competitive or even really fair are the elections in Russia? They seem to be very much controlled by President Putin. On top of that, you've got the violations of the civil liberties and civil rights in Russia as well. Like there's persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. They have definite severe restrictions on the media. When we think about Iran, remember that the candidates are all vetted. Remember, that's that power that the Guardian Council has the two V's. They have the power to veto and the power to vet. And in that vetting of candidates, they decrease the number of people who are running for office. And that is decreasing your electoral competition. And so that's not a competitive election. And that's part of the reason that makes that authoritarian state. Also, the power that the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, has. We look at citizen political participation. Do you have a healthy civil society? Like, are there people participating in elections? Do people turn out to vote? Do they feel like they are able to get out and vote? Do they feel like their vote matters? Is the media controlled? We know it's controlled in China. We know it's controlled in Russia. We know it's controlled in Iran. Okay, those are all things that are going to examine whether or not you truly have a liberal democracy. Is there separation of powers? Now, we know that countries who have parliamentarian states, like Britain, where your legislative and executive are in the same house, same branch, that you're not going to have the same clear divides that you would see in a traditional federal three-branch like we would see in Nigeria, Mexico, the US. But is there branch independence? For example, in China, remember that the legislature, the National People's Congress, they just, as we say, rubber stamp. They just approve whatever the party gives them. That's not true independence from the executive branch. When we look at Mexico, historically, the legislature did the same thing, but now the legislature definitely questions the president. I would add with that too, what's your role of your independent judiciary? Do you even have an independent judiciary? Are they allowed judicial review? Do they have those questions? And a lot of that to me ties into rule of law. Rule of law is that, is everyone under the law? Are the rules followed? Is the law followed? So I have this lovely little chart that I also took from Mr. Canine that he shared through CitizenU. So you see it has each country that we're studying, our CG6, and then discusses which one has democratic rule of law and which one has authoritarian rule. And so we have that 3-3, Mexico, Nigeria, and the UK, which we consider democratic, although they vary on their lines. So like the UK is the most democratic, Nigeria would be the least of those three. And then we have our authoritarian, China being the most authoritarian. So in a rule of law, when we pass from one person to the other, a true transfer of power, no question, wonderful example of a true rule of law. Impeachment in our country would be an example of rule of law. When there's votes and elections, all those things that are happening. In Nigeria, the president tried to have a third term. The national legislature said, nope, we're not letting you do that. And it didn't happen. That's true rule of law. Versus in China, when President Xi Jinping decided that he wanted to end the constitutional term limit of 10 years and wanted to make it unlimited, no one stopped him because there is no rule of law in China. The protests in 2019 over President Ahmadinejad's re-election, people protested. It ended very violently. It was horrible. There was coercion even happening in there, and that is an example of rule of law putting that down. Russia invading and taking over Crimea, another example. They're not following rule of law. All right? So rule of law would be something that we see happening in a democracy. We're not going to see rule of law in an authoritarian state. So let's think about that. Going with that whole idea of democratization. So how does democracy happen? Democratization, remember, is the process or the growth of democracy. So how do you do that? Think about within our own country, the United States, how has democracy expanded? Look at the expansion of suffrage. Have we given more people the right to vote? Lowering the voting age, ensuring that women get the right to vote. For example, women didn't always have the right to vote in any of these countries that we're studying. Women gained the right to vote. Also, you know, how we've lowered the age. We've, some countries, they don't allow certain minority groups certain rights and stuff. So for example, in Iran, remember the Baha'i we talked about, they don't receive as many rights. There are reserved seats in the Majlis in their legislature for many religious minorities, such as Christians, Zoroastrians, and Jews, but there is not one for the Baha'i. The Baha'i are very persecuted in Iran. Democracy, you want to ensure that you have free, fair, competitive elections. How can you do that? So the IEFC was formed in Mexico, which to make sure that the elections were happening fairly. Nigeria is working on kind of ending that election corruption and ensuring that they're having free, fair elections. Even the way they do their electoral systems can encourage that. For example, one of the things I love about Nigeria's electoral system is they do that runoff election. Remember that Iran and Russia also do that. If one candidate doesn't get over 50%, then you have a runoff election. But what I also love, because Nigeria is so diverse, remember that any candidate has to get 2/3 of the vote in at least 50%. Like it has to, they have that whole idea that you have to, 2/3 of the nation, you have to have 50% of the vote. And so because of the diverseness of Nigeria, this is really going to make that more equitable. Also providing proportional electoral system, okay? So most countries are using first past the post or winner take all. But the fact that you're allowing third parties greater access, that would be another way to ensure competitive elections. Making sure civil liberties and civil rights are protected. I don't want to keep beating a dead horse here with the freedom of the press and speech and all of those things. Increasing in civic engagement. So your civil society. Remember, we always we talk about how that this is a word that people really kind of struggle with every year in comparative government. But we're talking about, in essence, interest groups, okay, that you can voluntarily be in a group. It's not government controlled. It is voluntary participation. So that would be a pluralist state. So the United States and now the UK and Mexico's getting there are considered to be pluralist states that used to be, the United States wasn't, but Mexico and the UK were corporate estates. And if you look at Russia and China, they have very little civil society because most stuff is controlled by the government. It's not a voluntary participation in a group. How transparent is your government? Do you know what's going on? And then rule of law. What can hurt democratization? An example would be like in Iran, when the government put down the protests. So people were protesting the elections and they were put down. Your goal is one of these vocabulary words that I haven't mentioned a whole lot, but it's an important word, democratic consolidation. Think about when something is consolidated, it's compressed down. So democratic consolidation means that your democracy is tight, okay? Nobody, it's gonna take a lot to break up that democracy. Like think about democracy in the United States. What would it take to end democracy in the United States? It would take something huge, okay? A huge revolution for that to happen. So that's what you want. You want that democratic consolidation to happen. Nigeria is still a rather fragile state. Something could happen. They could have a military takeover and it could all kind of fall away. It would take a lot for that to happen in the United States or in the UK. I would even argue it would take a lot in Mexico at this point. So what are our sources of power and authority? We've talked about these terms a lot. I use these terms that we have traditional, like in the UK, rational legal, which is your constitution, elections, charismatic authority with people like Putin and Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini, the original one, Mao Zedong. I would say Xi Jinping also has that charismatic authority. And then there's also religious authority, which the Ayatollah has. Even a political party can be a source of power and authority. Like think about what is the central power and what runs China, the Communist Party of China, the CPC. The military can also be a source of power and authority. We talked about that in Nigeria, how that often helps to stabilize. How do changes happen in power and authority? I used Russia as an example. So we have think about revolution versus coup. So we have a revolution here when the bottom with Vladimir Lenin. He led a revolution. The Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which ended the absolute monarchy, the regime that they had. They were the state of Russia. They continue to be Russia, okay? And they became a authoritarian state under communism, and he became the leader. And then when he died, it became Stalin, and so on. They then had an example of a coup. This is a picture up in the top right there, is an example of the coup that they had after, at the very end of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, with the attempted coup. Now, we know that the coup ultimately failed, and they didn't oust Gorbachev, but their goal was to overthrow the leader, to overthrow the government. So remember that a revolution, think about the R's, a revolution tries to make a regime change, okay? And a coup tries to make a change in your leader, in your government. Now, another type of change in power authority in the bottom column, bottom picture there on the right, would be an election, okay? Elections, constitutional changes, all those can be changes in authority and power. And so we know that we have peaceful changes through elections for all the leaders in our various countries that we're studying. I do want to look over here just a moment. I want to look at a sample kind of question here so that we can look at what one of these would look like, okay? So these are questions that Mr. Kaneen has written, okay? So let's look at a sample essay here. Develop an argument that assesses the relationship between democratic consolidation and political legitimacy, okay? So democratic consolidation, that whole like, you're a tight democracy, and political legitimacy. Now, the concept, of course, has to be rule of law, right? So what role does rule of law play in all of these? Okay, remember that rule of law is an essential part of democracy. So in your response, you have to have a defensible claim, a thesis, and then you have to have two pieces of evidence, and the evidence comes from the two countries that we study. Now, the countries that you're given a list here, I will imagine that much like the US government, where you only got 2 required documents, that you will probably not get much choice in your country. They typically give you 4. I'm gonna imagine they're only gonna give you 3, maybe 2. So we have Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and the UK to discuss. So let's think about it for the moment. Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia, UK. Which ones have rule of law, which ones don't? Mexico has it. Nigeria mostly has it. Russia, no. UK, yes. Okay. All right, now I'm going to scroll down to the answer here. A nice little answer that was written so you can kind of see exactly how this works. So you've got your claim and reason, your evidence and reason, your evidence and your reason. Think about those words. We talked about those turn signals so that people know what you're talking about. While rule of law is a characteristic of democratic consolidation with laws that apply to all citizens equally, a regime's political legitimacy is not dependent upon democratic consolidation. Okay? That's a great point, because you do have to have rule of law to be a democracy, but you don't have to have rule of law to be a legitimate government. Okay? China, Russia, Iran all have political legitimacy, but they don't have rule of law. Because Russia showed that as a regime veered away from its rule of law system, the regime's political legitimacy increased with Putin's move towards authoritarianism. Political legitimacy is not dependent on a regime's democratic consolidation, because a regime can build political legitimacy even in more authoritarian ways, such as by the use of nationalism. Okay, so there's your claim and your reason. And then we're going to look here. Our democratic consolidation can include a rule by law system where laws apply to all citizens equally, but a regime's political is not dependent because. So this first one, they only have the claim and the reason. Now we need to have evidence, right? So do you see how, what we're going to see is each of these are going to get better, okay? So this one talks about how Russia's regime, and goes on to talk about Putin in power, okay? And then talks more about this. Now, to succeed at this question, what do they got to do? They got to have another country, okay? So here they continue to talk about, they give another evidence, but it's from the same country. My suggestion is you want to give evidence from a separate country, all right? We're going to do more practice of this. This is a difficult one. I just wanted to get you a little bit of idea, kind of what one looks like, okay? All right, let's do one that would actually be a little bit easier, okay? So let's look here. This is, I think the quantitatives are easier. You can disagree with me. So here's a sample quantitative. This is related to Unit 1. All right. This one is a little bit of an economic one, but I think we can handle this one. So we've got the country, the HDI, the Gini coefficient, and the GDP per capita. Explain how a data trend in the table relates to the political stability in Nigeria. So let's look at Nigeria. They have a pretty low Human Development Index, and the GDP per capita is really low. Might this contribute to the political instability in Nigeria? Okay, so we talked about this concept of how Nigeria could be considered a failed state because if you can't even provide for the basic needs of your country, so this is a threat to their political stability. That's one possible way you could approach this question. Using the data in the table, draw a conclusion about the relationship between HDI and GDP per capita. So what do we notice? Do you notice a trend? What I notice is that the higher your GDP is, the higher your HDI is, okay? So that would be the relationship, the conclusion that I would draw. There seems to be a correlation, for sure, between GDP per capita and HDI. Explain how the data in the table relates to the welfare state in the United Kingdom, okay? So we could talk about how that because the United Kingdom has a healthy GDP, they are able to afford a welfare state for the United Kingdom. So if you're having a little brain moment and forget what the welfare state is in the UK, it was started after World War II, and a welfare state provides for the basic needs of your citizens of the country. And so there have been some cutbacks to it as the economy has decreased. So when they were doing austerity measures, when they were cutting back spending during the economic recession, they did cut back on some welfare state items. But because they are able to provide for these basic needs such as housing and unemployment and healthcare, they have a very high HDI, okay? You see that? We talk about relations. So I think there might be a sample answer to this. That's another, okay. A data trend that relates to the political stability. Nigeria has the lowest HDI score and the second highest income inequality and the lowest GDP per capita. It relates to political stability because the trend indicates that Nigeria has a significant concentration of income in a small group of wealthy citizens with a relatively small GDP and a poor score related to the HDI. This trend of data relates to the political instability in Nigeria because the data indicates the government faces an enormous challenge to create politics that extend life expectancy and educational opportunities. You could have said way less than what they're saying and still get it. But that because part is the key thing. So describe the trend and then the because aspect. All right, let's look at the next one. So a conclusion about the relationship between HDI and GDP is that countries with the highest GDP have the best scores in the Human Development Index, okay, which is exactly what we just said, okay? The data in the table were for welfare state because the UK's high HDI score is the highest, has invested significant funds to build up the National Health Service, okay? So we talked about that. So you don't have to put all these things in here, but you're getting the basic answer in there. You just want to make sure that you're answering all of the questions. All right, so here's where we left off yesterday. We're talking about a country, a state, has a choice. How do they want to distribute their power? And you basically have three options. You can be a unitary state, a confederal state, or a federal state. Of our CG6, it's very easy. There are 3 unitary and 3 federal. So think in your head if you got them all straight before I say them. So, or does anybody want to unmute and volunteer to do my unitary? Who can give me my 3 unitary?
Oh, I can. Oh, never mind. Sydney, you have it.
I can't hear anybody. Okay, then. All right. So unitary would be the United Kingdom, China, and Iran. Confederal, nobody basically functions as a confederal state today. The EU kind of is our best example. Federal would be Nigeria, Mexico, and Russia. Think about Russia's name. It's the Russian Federation. Mexico's official name, the United States. United States of Mexico? Mexican States. And then Nigeria is a federal republic, okay? So unitary, your power is consolidated, centralized at the national level, okay? You give some authority to your locals, okay? Your regional governments, they have some, but not a whole lot of power, okay? All the power really is coming from that unitary, that central. In a federal system, that power is shared, okay? So in every state, you've got regional authority and you've got your central authority. Where's that power? So if I'm a unitary state, that power is all in that central, okay? If I'm federal, it's a shared. In confederal, it's the opposite, okay? In confederal, the regionals have all the power and there's very little coming together, okay? But we want to focus on unitary and federal because that's what our CG6 are. And that's what most countries in the world actually are unitary. So it's actually not truly representative of our CG6 to have 3 and 3, 50%, you know, that are 1. So most countries in the world are actually unitary. We think about why you would want to be unitary, why you would want to be federal. We're going to start looking at those differences. Remember that federal is going to work often better in larger republics and also places that are more diverse. So then you take China. China is very large. Why doesn't China choose to be federal? China's government doesn't want to give up the power, okay? You take a country like Nigeria. Nigeria basically has to be federal because they are so diverse. Now, if I'm a unitary state and I've got all this power in the national government and my regional governments have this little bit of power, I can give them more power. The way that I give them power is through devolution. So we have seen that the Welsh, the Irish, the Northern Irish, and the Scottish have all had their parliaments recognized. They have a certain amount of authority. Now, ultimately, they still answer to the British government, to that UK government, to the House of Commons in London. But they've been given a certain amount of power through devolution. In a federal system, the opposite of that, taking away power, that would be where you're centralizing your authority, which is what we see in Russia, how that Putin continues to consolidate power and take power away from those regions that they have. When you think about federalism too, remember that this beautiful sharing of power that we have in the United States really does not work anywhere else, okay? Nowhere in the world does federalism work quite like it does in the United States. We literally are the poster child for this is what federalism should look like. So you take Nigeria, one of their big problems is their allocation of resources, that the states are very dependent upon the federal government for help. So I was just in a school board meeting, and in that school board meeting, Dr. Shook was talking about how that we basically have a 2.1 million budget shortfall. Okay, we got 1 million less than we asked for from the school board. They gave us the exact same amount that they did from the board of supervisors. They gave us the exact same amount as last year. And then we're getting $1 million basically less from the Virginia government. Now, we weren't expecting as much. Our money comes from the state, right? Because we talk about education is primarily held by the states. If we were in Nigeria, our state would be very dependent upon that national government to provide any kind of help, okay? So that's really that difference there. So why do you choose? What's the advantages? Which one's better, okay? Really depends on your country. How diverse is your country? If you have a large, diverse country, federal is probably going to be your best bet, okay? So federal advantages, it's going to help protect all those different groups that you have. So we're going to make sure that all those hundreds of ethnicities that we see in Nigeria are going to be able to have a voice. It also kind of makes sure that there's a check to keep there from being too much power, you know, in the federal government, the national government, kind of that thing. Make sure that citizens, one of the things I love too is that citizens have more opportunities to engage politically and have a role in government because they can serve at the local level and the regional level before they even get up to the federal level. And it allows for experimentation. Wonderful example of is how we're handling the legalization of marijuana in the United States. The fact that some states are getting to experiment and we can learn from them. So whenever Virginia decides that they want to legalize marijuana, we can see what Colorado did right, what they did wrong. Okay, and we can take all those things into consideration. The other thing is, and I've mentioned this so many times when we talk about federalism, what's good for California is not necessarily what's good for Virginia. And when we think about this too, you think about that in Nigeria, think about that in Russia, think about that in Mexico. Like the issues that Mexico City faces are very different than what they're facing in northern Mexico and in southern Mexico. There's definite regional differences between the north and the south in Mexico. And so those fact that the states, those 30-some states get to have some authority in what they're doing makes a big difference, okay? Now, unitary, the best thing about unitary is there's way more equality, possibly even equity, if we want to say the difference between, you know, of course, equality and equity, is that resources can be distributed from richer areas to poorer areas. We can make sure that you as the national government are making decisions about what's best for your citizens. It also allows you to make sure that power is centralized in authority. You're also not going to have a difference of maybe conflicting what one state does versus what another state does. So, you know, what are the divorce laws in North Dakota? You know, like there's laws that are different in each state. Same thing happens in Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia, okay? So that's one thing you want to consider is that what's the differences, and whatever advantage of one, of course, is a disadvantage of the other. So when I ask the question, why would a unitary state want to devolve power? Why does the UK want to give power to Scotland and Wales? Okay, that's an important thing to think about. They want to prevent the ethnic groups from rising up, right? You want to try to make your ethnic groups happy. So take those advantages that are in the federal column, okay, and that's going to be what you need to do and that why you would want to become, in essence, more federal by devolving power. They also, and a big thing is to prevent people from getting upset, like Scotland. Scotland actually held a referendum whether or not they wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. And so by giving them more autonomy, giving them more power, then that hopefully is going to appease them and keep them in, okay? Think about that in China. Do they want to give the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, more authority? Now, in China, because they're authoritarian, kind of the opposite is happening. They've been putting Uyghurs into concentration camps. They took away the Dalai Lama in Tibet. You know, different countries teach people a different way. In Turkey, their response to the Kurds is to, you know, not allow them to speak their own language. Remember that in the UK for a while, it was against the law to speak Welsh. And they, not necessarily, I'm sorry, it wasn't against the law to speak Welsh. They didn't teach Welsh in school. And so the Welsh fought for that to get that back, okay? And so you want to think about that. Why would a unitary country devolve power? Why would they want to give power back to the regional governments? Okay. Any questions about federal versus unitary? Because this is a super important part of what we're talking about. This is one of those, when we think about like main concepts that I want to make sure I have a good grasp on, federal versus unitary, parliamentary versus presidential. Like those are two very key, I guess, technically 4 topics, but those concepts are really important. All right, so the last part that we have in Unit 1 is legitimacy and stability, okay? And so we often were getting the words legitimacy and authority mixed up. So I want you to understand, remember that authority or sovereignty is your right to rule, okay? So it's the right, the authority for your government to be in power, their right to have their power. Now, is that a legitimate source of power? Like, do we recognize that as a legitimate source of power, that they are a legitimate source of authority? That's where legitimacy comes in, okay? So it's whether or not the citizens perceive that the government actually has the right to use the powers the way that they do, okay? So there are ways that we can increase legitimacy, and our favorite answer, so when we were taking a regular test, I told you any question you ask, like one of the things that almost always an answer, right, is increases legitimacy. So if you have no idea what answer to put, increases legitimacy, it was almost always an answer. I'm not sure how well that's going to work for us on the way that this style test is working, sadly. But legitimacy is such an important concept. So what are your sources of legitimacy? Okay, I got listed a bunch here. These are all the things that the College Board tells us are sources, not just the College Board tells us, but they're in the College Board list. Okay, so obviously elections are sources of your legitimacy, right? And how stable your government is has to do with how is that perceive or perception of legitimacy. Nationalism can be a source of legitimacy. Tradition, how effective is your government? Like, do we trust our government? If I live in Nigeria, do I trust my government? Probably not, right? Their government is very corrupt. That's a big problem. Economic growth. So if you track back, I don't know how well you remember the recession when you were younger, but man, people had a lot of thoughts on the government at that point, okay? When the economy is not doing well, people have a lot of thoughts about the government, and they're not very happy thoughts. And so when the economy is doing well, maybe our trust in the government increases. Think about this. When you're thinking about legitimacy, you can almost sometimes equate it to trust in the government. For example, when we talk about decline in trust in American government, like Vietnam, how did that really decline the trust that we had in the government? So if you remember when Putin first took over, we actually talked about this, that there was that incident and that led to their Crimean War, and that some journalists have claimed that Putin actually, not he himself, but basically this terrorist attack that was attributed to the, to Chechnya, not to Crimea, I'm getting my C's mixed up here, to the Chechens, and then led to this war in Chechnya. It actually increased his popularity and all this. It was very good for his government. The economy has also grown under him. Like when people are like, how do people like him? Like he's taking away people's civil liberties. Economy has done super well under him. Like if you look at that little chart, if we look at the data, we're gonna see that it has grown. So those things can play a part. When we think about ideology can also influence things. Like we think about, so when the 2009 protests were happening in Iran, where they were protesting Ahmadinejad's re-election. Katie's not here. I can't make her say that 10 times fast. And so when the Ayatollah came forward and said, stop, people stopped, okay? Because of his religious authority, okay? Because they believe in him, that ideology that he has. When you think about in China, what are they doing it for? We're doing it for the Communist Party, that belief in that, or for Mao, or for Uncle Jai, or, you know, whatever it is that you believe. Religious heritage organizations, the dominant political party's endorsement, if they're saying this is okay. So how do we maintain legitimacy? All of these things, if we want to have elections that are legitimate, we need to make sure that we feel like that they are not corrupt, that they are being held. And you can go back again to like Mexico creating the IEFC, which puts a check on elections. You can do things like referendums. A referendum is a wonderful way to increase legitimacy. When the Russian Federation became Russia as opposed to the Soviet Union, one of the things that Yeltsin did was he had them vote on the Constitution through a referendum. Let the people vote on it, okay? And how can legitimacy be undermined? Corruption is one of the biggest ways that legitimacy can be undermined if people don't trust the government. There's other ways where we see where protests get put down when civil liberties and civil rights are kind of crushed. If you speak out and all those different kind of things. If you view your leaders as corrupt, how legitimate is that? If you think your elections are rigged, like there are a number of people, like the riot girls in Russia, they argue, of course, that the elections are not legitimate. And so when we talk about democracies, that first definition is that they have to be free, fair, competitive elections. And that's why people are saying that Russia, we can't even really consider it. Can we even really consider it a democracy if they're not truly fair, free, competitive elections? Okay. All right. So that wraps up Unit 1.